There is a night that comes to every person who has spent their life giving their light to someone who only ever wanted to feed on it. It does not arrive with thunder. It does not arrive with a scream. It arrives quietly in the middle of an ordinary evening when you are washing a dish or driving home in the rain or simply sitting alone in a room that suddenly feels too silent, and something inside you, something old and patient, finally opens its eyes and says, I see you now. I see exactly what you are. And in that moment, the whole architecture of your life begins very slowly to fall. I want to talk to you tonight about that moment. Not the moment you met them, not the moment you fell in love with the mask, but the moment the mask came off and stayed off, and you were left standing in the wreckage of your own devotion, looking at a stranger you had loved for years. This is not a story about villains and victims. I do not believe in villains, not really. I believe in the unconscious, and I believe in what happens to a soul when it refuses again and again to look at its own darkness. But I also believe in you. I believe in the empath, that rare and burdened soul who feels everything, who absorbs the pain of others as though it were their own, who mistakes their own boundless capacity for love as proof that love alone can heal any wound. I am here tonight to tell you what happens when that soul finally wakes up. And I promise you, it is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of the only story that ever mattered, the story of you becoming whole. So let us begin. For a long time, longer than you would like to admit, you believed you were the exception. You believed that your love was different, that your patience had a kind of alchemy to it, that if you simply loved hard enough, saw clearly enough, forgave generously enough, the person across from you would finally soften. You believed, in the quiet architecture of your heart, that you had been given this gift of deep feeling for a reason, and that reason, you told yourself, was to save someone. This is the first illusion. And I want you to hear this gently, because I am not scolding you. I am naming something ancient. The empath does not fall in love with a person, not at first. The empath falls in love with a potential. They see the wounded child behind the charming adult. They see the flicker of vulnerability behind the bravado, the flash of loneliness behind the grandiosity, and something in them, something noble, something that has perhaps been starved of its own tending, reaches out and says, I can heal this. I can be the one who finally gets through. And for a while, it feels like a sacred calling. It feels like the most important work you have ever done. You study them. You learn their moods the way a sailor learns the sky. You anticipate the storm before it breaks, and you rearrange your own weather to keep the peace. You give explanations for their coldness. You give context for their cruelty. You say, they had a difficult childhood. They don't know how to receive love. They are afraid, underneath it all, of being truly seen. And you are not wrong, by the way. This is what makes it so difficult. You are not wrong about the wound. Every narcissist was, at some point, A child who learned that their authentic self was not safe to show, that love was conditional, that admiration was safer than intimacy, that being seen fully was more dangerous than being seen falsely. Somewhere in that child's history is a version of the same wound you carry, the same ache for belonging that lives in every human heart. But here is what you did not understand, not yet, not in those early years. A wound does not obligate anyone to heal it. And your love, however vast, however patient, however sacrificial, cannot do the work that only they can choose to do for themselves. You cannot love someone into self-awareness. You cannot feel enough on their behalf to make them finally feel their own life. This is the tragedy at the center of every empath's devotion to a narcissist. You are trying to complete, with your own soul, a task that only their soul can complete. And they will let you try. Oh, they will let you try for years. Because here is the truth about the one who wears the mask. They need you to keep trying. Your effort is not incidental to the relationship. It is the fuel that runs it. Every time you interpret their coldness generously, every time you absorb blame that was never yours, every time you shrink your own needs so as not to disturb their fragile equilibrium, you are performing an act of psychological labor that they depend upon and will never acknowledge, because to acknowledge it would mean admitting that they need anything at all. And admitting need for a person who has built an entire identity on the appearance of invulnerability feels like death. So the pattern repeats. You give, they take. You explain their behavior to yourself in the softest possible light, because the alternative, that they simply do not love you the way you love them, is too unbearable to hold. And so you hold the wound instead. You hold it for both of you. You become the container for a grief that was never yours to carry. And you call this container love because you do not yet have another word for it. I want to pause here and speak plainly, because this is important. This is not weakness. I have heard people say that empaths who stay too long in these relationships are naive or foolish or secretly addicted to suffering. This is a shallow reading of a very deep phenomenon. What is actually happening is this: the empath is doing in the outer world a version of the inner work that every human soul is called to do. You are trying to integrate the shadow. You are trying to bring light into a place of darkness. This is not a foolish impulse. This is one of the noblest impulses the human psyche possesses. Your error was never in the impulse itself. Your error was in believing you could do this work for another person, standing outside of them, rather than doing it within yourself, where it actually belongs. And so the years pass, and something begins to happen to you that you do not notice at first, because it happens the way erosion happens, slowly, invisibly, one small surrender at a time. You begin to doubt your own perceptions. You begin to apologize for things you did not do. You begin to feel a strange, low-grade exhaustion that has no name, because you cannot point to any single event and say, this is what is wrong. Nothing dramatic has happened, and yet you are disappearing. This is what I want you to understand about the psychological experience of loving a narcissist. It is not one great wound. It is 1,000 small erosions, each one so minor that you talk yourself out of noticing it, until one day you look in the mirror and do not entirely recognize the person looking back. You have become fluent in a language of self-erasure. You have learned to make yourself smaller in rooms where you once took up space freely. You have learned to swallow your own instincts, because your instincts, when voiced, were met with denial, deflection, or a wounded counterattack that somehow always left you comforting them for the crime of noticing your own pain. There is a name for this in the deepest layers of the psyche. It is what happens when a person is repeatedly told that their perception of reality is wrong until they can no longer trust the very organ, the soul, that perceives reality at all. And I want to say something to you now that I need you to really receive. This is not madness. You were not going crazy. You were being systematically, if often unconsciously, taught to distrust yourself by someone who could not tolerate being truly seen. Their denial was never really about you. It was about their own unbearable relationship with their own darkness. But it landed on you, and it cost you dearly. Now, let us come to the night I spoke of at the beginning, the night the seeing finally happens. I want you to notice something about how this awakening arrives, because it is rarely dramatic. People imagine that clarity comes like a lightning bolt, a single catastrophic betrayal so enormous that the truth becomes impossible to deny. Sometimes it does happen this way, but far more often, far more commonly, the seeing arrives the way dawn arrives, not with an explosion of light, but with a slow, undeniable graying of the darkness, until I realize the night is simply over, and it has been over for longer than you knew. It often begins with something small, a lie so minor it would once have slipped past you unnoticed, a moment of cruelty dressed up as honesty, a callousness toward someone else, a waiter, a stranger, a child, that reveals for just a flicker of a second the machinery beneath the charm. And something in you, something that has been quietly gathering evidence for years without your conscious permission, finally says, I have seen this before. I have seen this 1,000 times. I simply never let myself add it up. This is the moment I want to speak to directly, because it is one of the most important moments in a human life. It is the moment the unconscious hands its evidence to the conscious mind and says, here, I have been keeping this file for years. Look at it now. You are ready, and you are never quite ready. Let me be honest with you about this, because I will not stand here and pretend that seeing clearly is a gentle process. It is not gentle. It is one of the most disorienting experiences a soul can undergo, because in that moment you are not simply losing an illusion about another person. You are losing an illusion about yourself. You are losing the story in which your love was powerful enough to heal anyone. You are losing the story in which you were the hero of a rescue narrative. And in its place stands a much harder, much more honest story, one in which you were for a long time a participant in your own erasure, and the person you were trying to save was never actually lost. They were simply never looking for what you were offering. This is grief. I want to name it precisely because so many people mistake it for anger, or for relief, or for regret, when actually it is grief in its purest form, the grief of losing a future you had built entirely out of hope, brick by brick, for years, without ever noticing that the ground beneath it was never solid. You will grieve the person you thought they were. You will grieve the version of them that existed only in the earliest days, before the mask began to slip, or perhaps only in the story you told yourself about who they could become. You will grieve the years, and I will not lie to you. This is often the hardest part. You will grieve the years themselves, the ones you gave to a project that could never be completed because you were building on a foundation that was never designed to hold weight. But here is what I need you to understand, and I say this not as comfort, but as fact. Grief is not a sign that something has gone wrong. Grief is the sign that something true is finally being processed. You cannot integrate what you refuse to grieve. And so this grief, as heavy as it feels, is not your enemy. It is the doorway. It is the price of admission to your own life, finally returned to you. And after the grief, often overlapping with it, sometimes arriving before it, comes the anger. Oh, the anger. I want to speak about this honestly because so much of our culture is uncomfortable with anger, especially in those of us who have spent our lives being gentle, being accommodating, being the emotional caretakers of everyone around us. We are taught that anger is unbecoming, that it is a failure of our higher nature, that the truly evolved soul rises above it. I want to offer you a different understanding. Anger, when it arrives after years of self-abandonment, is not a fall from grace. It is the psyche's oldest and most honest messenger, arriving finally to say, this was not acceptable. What was done to you was not acceptable. And the fact that you tolerated it for so long does not mean you deserved it. It means you were taught, perhaps very early in your life, long before this relationship began, that your own needs were negotiable. Let that sink in for a moment, because I think it is one of the most important truths I can offer you tonight. The narcissist did not create your capacity for self-abandonment. They found it. Somewhere in your history, a parent who needed you to be easy, a family that rewarded your silence, a childhood that taught you love, was something you earned through usefulness rather than something you were owed simply for existing. Somewhere in there, a pattern was laid down, and the narcissist, whether consciously or not, recognized that pattern the way a lock recognizes its key. This is not your fault, but it is your responsibility now, because you are the only one who can change it. So let the anger come. Do not perform it for anyone. Do not apologize for it. Let it move through you the way weather moves through a landscape, fully, completely, without your management or your shame. Anger that is felt and allowed to pass through does not calcify into bitterness. It is only the anger we refuse to feel, the anger we swallow and store and pretend does not exist, that turns into something corrosive. Feel it, let it burn clean, and trust that on the other side of it is not a harder heart, but a clearer one. Now, I want to talk about what happens after the seeing, after the grief, after the anger has done its work, because this is where the real transformation begins, and it is far more extraordinary than anything I have described so far. When you finally see the narcissist clearly, not as a puzzle to be solved, not as a wound to be healed by your devotion, but simply as a person who has organized their entire life around the avoidance of their own depths, something remarkable happens to your relationship with your own depths. You begin to understand that the very qualities that made you so susceptible to this dynamic, your empathy, your capacity to feel deeply, your instinct to search for the light in every darkness, these are not flaws to be corrected. They are not evidence of some deficiency that needs fixing. They are, in fact, the very same forces that will now carry you home to yourself, if you allow them to turn inward instead of only ever outward. This is the great turning. For so long, you poured your gift of deep feeling into another person's psyche, hoping it would illuminate them. Now, I am asking you to turn that same gift toward your own psyche and illuminate yourself. Because here is what almost no one tells you about empaths who have loved narcissists. You did not lose your capacity for insight in that relationship. You sharpened it. Every time you sensed a shift in mood before it was spoken, every time you felt a lie before it was fully told, every time your body tensed in a room before your mind understood why, you were building an instrument of extraordinary sensitivity. That instrument was misused for years, pointed outward at someone who did not deserve the resolution it offered. But the instrument itself is intact. It is, in fact, remarkable, and it is entirely yours to redirect. This is what I mean when I speak of individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who you actually are, beneath every mask, beneath every role you have played for the comfort of others, beneath every adaptation you made to survive. Individuation does not happen in comfort. It happens in exactly this kind of rupture, when the story you were living breaks apart and you are forced, whether you wanted to be or not, to ask the only question that ever really matters. Who am I when I am not organizing myself around someone else's approval? This is a terrifying question. I will not pretend otherwise. For years, perhaps your entire life, your sense of self was built in relation to others. What they needed, what they approved of, what kept the peace, what earned the love. And now, in the wreckage of this relationship, you are being asked to build a self that does not depend on anyone else's validation to exist. This is the hardest work a human being can do. It is also the only work that leads to real freedom. I want you to think for a moment about what it actually means to be an empath. truly, in the deepest sense of the word. It does not mean being endlessly available. It does not mean absorbing every emotion in every room until you no longer know which feelings are yours. That is not empathy in its mature form. That is empathy that has never learned where it ends and another person begins. Mature empathy has a boundary. It can feel deeply for another person while remaining rooted in its own ground. It can hold compassion for someone's wound without volunteering to be consumed by it. This is the empath you are becoming now, not less feeling, but more discerning, not less open, but more sovereign. And sovereignty, I want to be clear, is not coldness. Do not let anyone, including the voice of your own fear, convince you that healing from this means becoming hardened, guarded, suspicious of every tender feeling that arises in you. That would be its own kind of loss. And frankly, it would be a victory for exactly the wound you are trying to heal. No, the goal is not to feel less. The goal is to feel just as deeply, but to finally place that depth of feeling inside a self strong enough to hold it. A self that does not need another person's approval to know its own worth. Let me speak now about the moment of confrontation, because many of you will face this or have already faced it, the moment you finally say aloud what you have seen. I want to prepare you for something important. Do not expect them to receive it the way you hope. You will want, understandably, some acknowledgement, some flicker of recognition, some moment where the mask drops entirely and the real person underneath says, "You are right, I have hurt you, I am sorry. I have to tell you, with as much compassion as I can offer, that this moment very often does not come. And if it does come, it often does not last, because a person who has spent a lifetime avoiding their own depths cannot simply stand in front of them because you have asked them to. The defenses that protect a narcissist from their own unbearable feelings were not built in a day, and they will not fall in a single conversation, however honest, however brave, however long overdue. This is not a reason to stay silent. Speak your truth if you need to speak it, not for their transformation, but for your own integrity, so that you know when you finally walk away that you left nothing unsaid that needed saying. But release now any expectation that your words will be the key that finally unlocks their capacity for self-awareness. That was never your job. It was never anyone's job but their own. You can open a door. You cannot make another soul walk through it. I want to say something now about forgiveness, because I know this word arrives eventually in every story like this one, and I want to speak about it carefully, because it is so often misunderstood. Forgiveness does not mean reconciliation. It does not mean forgetting. It does not mean inviting the same dynamic back into your life under a gentler name. Forgiveness, in its truest and deepest sense, is not something you offer to the other person at all. It is something you offer to yourself. It is the moment you stop expecting the past to have been different. It is the moment you stop demanding that the story makes sense in a way that satisfies your sense of justice. It is the moment you finally set down the weight of carrying both your pain and their unacknowledged responsibility for causing it, and you walk forward carrying only what is yours. This does not happen quickly. I would be lying to you if I suggested it does. Forgiveness of this depth is not a single decision, it is a practice revisited many times, especially on the days when an old memory surfaces and the wound feels briefly as raw as it ever was. This is normal. Healing is not a straight line rising steadily upward. It is closer to a spiral. You will pass by the same terrain again and again. But each time, if you are doing the work, you pass a little higher up the mountain with a little more distance, a little more perspective, a little more compassion for the person you were when you did not yet know what you know now. And I want to speak, before I close, about what waits for you on the other side of this. Because there is another side, and it is more beautiful than you can currently imagine from where you stand. There is a particular kind of peace that only comes after this kind of reckoning, a peace that cannot be manufactured by avoiding pain, because it can only be built by moving through pain fully and coming out the other side intact. This peace is different from the peace you may have known before this relationship, before this awakening. That earlier peace was often, if you are honest with yourself, a kind of unconsciousness, a peace built on not looking too closely, not asking too many questions, not noticing the patterns that were quietly organizing your entire emotional life. This new peace is different. It is a peace built on having looked directly at the hardest truth you have ever faced and having survived it. It is a peace that has earned its own solidity. You will find in this new territory that your empathy returns to you transformed. You will still feel deeply, perhaps more deeply than ever, because you are no longer spending half your emotional energy managing someone else's fragile ego, but you will feel with discernment now. You will notice far earlier than before the subtle signs of a person who cannot tolerate being truly known. You will notice charm that arrives too quickly, admiration that seems to serve a purpose, warmth that vanishes the moment you assert a need of your own. And where once you would have explained these signs away, you will now simply notice them and trust what you notice and choose accordingly. This is not cynicism, this is wisdom. There is a profound difference between the two, and you have earned the right to know it. You will also find, and this may surprise you, a deepening of compassion, not for the specific person who hurt you necessarily, but for the wider human condition that produces people who cannot bear their own depths. You will understand, in a way you could not understand before, how a child becomes an adult who must perform confidence rather than feel it, who must control rather than trust, who must be admired rather than loved, because somewhere along the way, being truly loved for who they actually were felt too dangerous to risk. This understanding does not obligate you to stay near that person. It does not obligate you to excuse what was done to you, but it will soften something in you that anger alone cannot soften, and that softening, strangely enough, is part of what sets you free. Because here is the final truth I want to leave you with tonight, and I want you to carry it with you long after you have forgotten the rest of what I have said. The narcissist, in the end, is not the central character of your story. I know this may be hard to believe, because for so long they occupied the entire center of your attention, your energy, your hope, your grief. But they were never the point. They were the catalyst, the difficult, painful, entirely unwanted catalyst for a transformation that was always, in some sense, waiting to happen in you. The relationship was the fire, but the gold that emerges from fire was always yours. It was always in you long before you ever met them, waiting for enough heat to reveal it. You are not broken because this happened to you. You are not naive or foolish or lesser because you loved someone who could not love you back the way you needed. You are, in fact, someone who possesses one of the rarest and most valuable capacities a human being can have: the capacity to feel deeply, to see beneath the surface, to hold space for another person's pain. This capacity was exploited. It was not created by that exploitation, and it will not be destroyed by it either, unless you allow the experience to convince you that feeling deeply is dangerous. Do not let it convince you of that. The lesson was never feel less. The lesson was feel deeply, and also, finally, protect what you feel. I want to speak now about the smaller, quieter work, because so much of what I have described tonight sounds like a single dramatic passage, a before and an after, and I do not want to leave you with that impression. The truth is that rebuilding a relationship with yourself does not happen in one grand gesture. It happens in 1,000 small, almost invisible decisions made daily, often when no one else is watching and no one else will ever know they were made at all. It happens the first time you notice a small discomfort in your body, a tightening in your chest, a hesitation in your throat. And instead of overriding it the way you have been trained to do, you actually stop and ask it what it is trying to tell you. It happens the first time you say no to something small, something that costs you almost nothing to refuse, simply to prove to the oldest, most frightened part of yourself that refusal does not end in abandonment. It happens the first time you catch yourself beginning to explain away someone else's unkindness, and instead of finishing the explanation, you simply let the thought stop mid-sentence and ask yourself quietly, why am I doing this again? These moments will feel small. They will feel at times almost embarrassingly small compared to the size of what you have survived. But I want you to understand something about how the psyche heals, because it does not heal the way a story heals, with a single climactic scene that resolves everything. It heals the way a body heals, cell by cell, day by day, mostly without your notice, until one day you realize you have been standing differently, breathing differently, moving through the world with a spine you did not have a year before. Part of this quiet work is learning to sit with silence without filling it with anxiety about what someone else might be thinking or feeling. For years, if you loved a narcissist, your inner world was never fully your own. Some part of you was always scanning the emotional weather of another person, always half a step outside yourself, monitoring, adjusting, managing, learning to simply exist in a room, in a thought, in a feeling. Without that constant outward vigilance is one of the most radical acts of self-restoration available to you. It will feel strange at first. It may even feel a little frightening, the way silence often feels frightening to those who have spent years needing to stay useful, alert, and one step ahead in order to feel safe. Sit with it anyway. That discomfort is not a sign that something is wrong. It is the sound of an old alarm system slowly, finally, being allowed to power down. You will also need to grieve, in a smaller and stranger way, the identity you built around being the strong one, the understanding one, the one who could handle anything. This identity served a purpose once. It may even have kept you safe in ways you are only beginning to understand. But it also asked a great deal of you, and it asked it silently, without ever once asking whether you had anything left to give. Part of becoming whole is learning that you are allowed to be the one who needs care too. You are allowed to be tired. You are allowed to not have the answer. You are allowed to fall apart in front of someone or in front of no one at all, without that falling apart meaning you have failed at some invisible test of endurance you never agreed to take. And in the midst of all of this, the small refusals, the quiet reclamations, the strange new silences you are learning to sit inside, something else begins to happen that I think is worth naming directly, because it is easy to miss. You begin to trust yourself again, not in a single dramatic instant, but the way trust is always rebuilt between two people who have hurt each other, slowly, through a long accumulation of small kept promises. Except this time, both people are you. The self who doubted and the self who is learning, one small honored instinct at a time, to be believed again. So when that night comes, and if it has not come yet, it will, when you finally see them clearly, when the mask does not go back on, no matter how hard they try to wear it, when the story you told yourself for years quietly dissolves and leaves you standing in a truth you cannot unsee, do not be afraid of that moment. It is not the collapse of your world. It is the excavation of your actual life, buried for years beneath a story that was never really yours to carry. Grieve what needs grieving. Rage where rage is honest. Forgive when forgiveness finally arrives on its own timeline, not before. And then, slowly, patiently, the way any true thing is built, begin to turn that extraordinary gift of feeling back toward yourself. Ask yourself the questions you spent years asking on their behalf. What do you need? What do you fear? What have you been avoiding all this time by staying so faithfully focused on someone else's darkness? Because the truth, the whole truth, The reason any of this happened at all is that you were never meant to spend your life illuminating someone else's shadow while your own light went untended. You were meant to become whole. Every tear, every sleepless night, every moment you doubted your own perception, and then finally trusted it again. All of it was the long, difficult, necessary road toward becoming a person who belongs fully to themselves. That is what happens when the empath finally sees the narcissist for who they are. Not just an ending, not just a devastating clarity about someone else, but a beginning, the real beginning, the one that was waiting for you the entire time, underneath every illusion you had to lose in order to find it. Go and become whole. You have already done the hardest part. You have finally opened your eyes.